I thought you were babysitting that kid.
We're the same age.
I thought he was like in kindergarten or something.
Roderick, I don't think you can say that. Diary of a Wimpy Kid: The Long Haul was the biggest disappointment since my college years. Welcome to my channel. The Diary of a Wimpy Kid books were always favourites of mine when I was a child and was actually capable of experiencing joy. It was an incredibly simple premise following borderline sociopath Greg Heffley in his journey through middle school and descent into madness being documented in his many journals. The original charm of the series was how grounded it was and how relatable many of the scenarios were, and it was never too concerned with being incredibly wacky just to be amusing. Even as an adult, I can read the first 6 books and still appreciate the more grounded humorous moments like disrespecting the elderly and Roderick being a misogynist. After Cabin Fever though, you can feel the series slowly falling off, and then eventually they just kept making the situations wackier to compensate. I stopped reading them after Double Down, so I can't really speak for the rest of the books since then. However, I am a fan of the original live-action trilogy, adapting the first 4 books. They're not good movies or anything, but they're plenty charming, and pretty funny sometimes. And if you don't agree with me, I will have you shot and killed. They managed to adapt the books fairly well. In terms of casting, this is probably the most perfect cast ever assembled. Like the Avengers— no, get that malarkey out my face. The cast chemistry alone makes these movies worth watching in my opinion, as they breathed so much life into each scene even as they kept getting older with each film. Like them or not, there's no denying these films are kind of iconic and some of the first things people think of when the franchise is brought up. So seeing The Long Haul release in 2017 and just absolutely obliterating everything people liked about the previous films was a bit hard to watch for many teens whose childhoods were made by them. As someone who endlessly rewatched the original trilogy of Wimpy Kid movies as a kid, I too was joining in with all the negative reviews and not my Rodericks of the world. This was my personal Archduke friends Ferdinand. It took everything that was charming about the original movies and decided, how about we don't? It was also released around the same time I developed depression as a 12-year-old, so I choose to believe this movie is cursed. Naturally, after its miserable reviews and box office performance, many believed it was time for the series to either be put to rest or for a reboot of some kind to give it some new energy. And as a proud Wimpy Kidder myself— God, that sentence sucked— I was happy to hear that this new direction would be in the form of an animated adaptation based on the first book. Animation just seemed to fit the Wimpy Kid franchise far more than live action did, as much as I loved these movies. And when we got a glimpse of an animation test with a similar animation style to the Peanuts movie that everyone likes, the movie being good seemed like a safe bet. It's okay to be wrong sometimes. Since 2021, Disney have been releasing animated adaptations of the Diary of a Wimpy Kid books onto Disney+, starting with the first book in 2021, Roderick Rules in 2022, and Cabin Fever in a few days as of recording this audio. To be perfectly blunt, these movies are a bitch. To elaborate, the original live-action trilogy was incredibly charming and funny specifically because it was so perfectly cast, and managed to adapt the loose storytelling of the books into a 3-act structure. Everyone involved was elevating the material they had been given, even though a lot of it boiled down to cringe comedy. And just to be clear, I was joking earlier, if you don't like the cringe comedy of these movies, I won't actually have you shot and killed. I'm not Candace Owens. There was also the fact that these movies were not genuinely painful to look at. The new Wimpy Kid movies, on the other hand, are miserably bland, painfully unfunny despite lifting many of its jokes from the original book, cut out insane chunks of the original books to lower the runtime, become so mean-spirited that they managed to somehow make Greg a likable character, which just— no, and are some of the ugliest looking animated movies I have ever seen, and I am disappointed and mad and sad, which are completely hell for reactions to have as an adult when you watch a movie titled Diary of a Wimpy Kid. I got so annoyed at how inferior these movies are to the live action ones that I suddenly wrote an entire video about them and how much they suck. Also, because Cabin Fever is a Christmas movie and is releasing in a few days as of recording this audio, this is technically my first Christmas review. So please sit back and relax, because I won't. Alright, let's get it out of the way first. Why does the animation make me recoil in disgust the same way as when I view an active colonoscopy? Don't ask me how I'd know what that looks like, I'm forbidden from providing a source here. On paper— going in an animated direction for Diary of a Wimpy Kid makes a lot of sense. While it certainly wouldn't be the most breathtaking looking movie by a long shot, there's a lot of charm to the simple drawings in the books that can be easily replicated in 2D, but can also be cleverly incorporated in 3D animation too. I'm getting tired of bringing up Spider-Verse this year, so we're gonna use the Peanuts movie from 2015 as an example. It does a fantastic job of keeping the charm and appeal of the characters' 2D elements, while effectively bringing them into a 3D animated world, in a way that doesn't make their designs, which are designed to be viewed in comic strips and traditional animation, look uncanny uncanny or even all that strange. It's a very unique and charming aesthetic, and it's incredibly faithful to the source material with how a lot of the shots are framed like it's being animated in 2D, while incorporating hand-drawn 2D elements into the mix, like speed lines as a replacement for 3D animated motion blur. When we were told Diary of a Wimpy Kid would be getting an animated movie, many people naturally assumed they would take this approach, especially when we got that animation test that seemed to be right on the money. So what happened exactly? The actual animation isn't terrible, but purely going off aesthetics alone, this is one of the most ugly looking animated movies I have ever watched. What made the Peanuts movie work is that the stylized animation used all kinds of cheats and tricks to have the characters be viewed from a 2D perspective while keeping the quality of their CG animation, and it's why all of the character models are stylized specifically so they can be viewed from that perspective, because the moment you search up Charlie Brown 3D model into Google Images, you're greeted by several agents of Lucifer. I assume they originally wanted to go for the Peanuts aesthetic but were given a very small budget, as the way the characters' faces are animated and the way their models are made give the impression they were intended to be viewed from a 2D perspective, but with the full 3D animation the films go for, it makes all these stylized features look absolutely It looks bad. Being completely honest here, I don't see a reason as for why a Disney production based on the 4th best-selling book series of all time was given such a miserable budget, or at least I assume so. There's no official source stating how much money actually went into this film. The closest I can find is on the Wimpy Kid wiki, saying it only cost like $10 million, with again no source. I'd say it was due to the pandemic, but the following movies all looked the same. Ah, I see they teach the body flicker early, I see. And considering the fact that Jeff Kinney, the author of the books, is a massive fan of the Peanuts, and you can see a lot of inspiration from it in his work, it's a crying shame we couldn't have gotten the film closer to the original vision. As it stands, we have a very ugly looking movie that clearly resembles the source material. Kind of, but lacking any appeal and charm. I've used the word charm like 5 times already. Where's my thesaurus? I suppose we should talk about the actual film now. I do like that it opens with a short animated segment in the style of the books. The original movies did do this as well, but it's good to at least be reminded that the source material was considered. Unfortunately, the movie begins after that. Let's go over some small stuff first. This movie has only around 2 minutes of screen time for Roderick. This, for those of you uninformed, is a sin. Although I do like that his explanation of middle school shows the animated segments in his own art style. It's also far more believable than Greg's drawings, because that would imply he draws everyone in this world perfectly, which is a little bit silly. Also, everyone has been recasted once again, and while I do like the voices everyone's been given, they lack the natural chemistry the OG actors had. Also, it's very evident this film was made during the pandemic because the audio quality is...
We were worried sick about you two. Where were you boys?
all over the place. What else? Oh, frankly. Unironically the best part of the film. Something that also bothered me about the film is that a lot of moments in the story felt a lot more mean than it was in the books and the live action movies. There's a bunch of scenes that are completely over-dramatized in this movie to sell the idea of how much of a hellhole middle school is. I know I could go on a data-based rant on why they're correct. There are a lot of moments in the original book where Greg gets his comeuppance for being a prick that are turned into completely unreasonable moments of harsh bullying in this adaptation. Greg Heffley is not a likable protagonist in the traditional sense. He's a character you like because he's such a self-centered, scheming egomaniac over the most minuscule of road bumps in his life. It's pathetic and funny on its own, and seeing him fail and get what he deserves for it is even better. In the original books, Greg is obsessed with the idea of being popular. It's literally one of the first things we get to know about him. He wants to become rich and famous and is using middle school as a means to build his reputation. He wants to be remembered by people. It's why he's constantly scheming when things don't go his way, and why he overreacts to everything childish that Rowley does. He has a clear goal in mind. Jeff Kinney keeps describing Greg as the misguided hero of the story because he eventually overcomes his flaws and does the right thing, though I would use far more radical descriptions than the word hero personally. The point is that Greg's self-importance and dick dastardly levels of scheming over a minor inconvenience to him is supposed to be funny, doubly so when these petty schemes backfire, and that there is some legitimately solid character work behind all the funny moments. Now I hope that after analysing the brain and character work of the man who created Creighton the Cretin will allow you to see why movie Greg just does not work. While Greg still desires to be rich and famous, cares about his image, and would like some of the benefits of being popular in this movie, he openly admits that he has no idea where he fits in and is incredibly worried about middle school, which recontextualizes everything he does as being far more sad and desperate than it already is, because he completely lacks the confidence that book and live action Greg had. Book and live action Greg both strut into middle school believing they're incredibly important and destined to be popular. It's what makes everything they do funny. When Greg's only concern is surviving middle school and trying not to be embarrassed or bullied, it stops making his scheming funny, and we instead start to genuinely dislike him for what he does, while at at the same time actually making him a sympathetic character that we feel sorry for, and this is not helped by Greg's comeuppances being spun around into harsh bullying in this adaptation. Like when Greg tries to clout chase by taking credit for breaking Rowley's arm, he just awkwardly gets shut down to the girls he's trying to impress in the book. In this movie, he gets dogpiled by the entire cafeteria for it and is chased out. Greg's embarrassment over Rowley using childish words like play instead of hang out goes from a couple students overhearing this and not doing much of anything, all the way to every student in the cafeteria pointing and laughing at Greg, and not Rowley for some reason. When Greg's comic gets censored by the school, it makes him look like a teacher's pet. The reaction is again completely overblown in the movie. In general, there's a lot of moments from the books that are completely exaggerated here to be far harsher examples of bullying, and this leads to Greg becoming a sympathetic and traditionally likable character. The total f***ing opposite of what you're supposed to be. Taking credit for breaking Rowley's arm and trying to become the school cartoonist are all moments of Greg trying to chase clout, and having it backfire tremendously. But when the reactions from students are completely overblown like this, it just ruins the intended effect. Even Greg being embarrassed over Rowley saying the word play, originally presented as a completely unreasonable action on his part in the book, is made completely reasonable because all the students just turn and laugh at him for some reason. The movie fundamentally misunderstands Greg Heffley, and that's a big problem because he's the most important part. He is John Wimpy Kid. Jeff Kinney has stated a number of times that he disagrees with the notion that Greg is a sociopath, even stating that some people are missing the joke for labeling him that way. But reading the books, you can have either interpretations of him being a messy kid and a sociopath, and both seem to work just fine in expressing the humor of the series. However, it should be noted that Kinney had a lot more creative control over this film than he did with the live-action movies, and was actually responsible for the screenplay, even saying he wanted to tell a better story than what's in the first book. I don't have anything to add to that, I just think that's an objectively funny sentence. Well, I guess you could argue that Jeff wanted the movie to communicate that Greg isn't a sociopath better than the books do, which is certainly one way to view it, and I personally think it's correct. But was it worth making the movie far less funny and cutting out so much content just so you can clear up a misconception people have had about your protagonist for the last 16 years? While the project was being developed, it took a number of forms, from a simple animated Christmas special to a full animated series, before essentially settling on being an animated reboot of the movies. I bring this up because it gives us some important context for many of the film's issues. The premise for every Wimpy Kid installment is always the same, just Greg Heffley ranting about his mundane middle school life and the antics that ensue from him ruining everything. That part's unchanged, and to the credit of these films, there aren't many creative liberties taken with the actual story beats the most of the time. However, the film's actual plot is an utter train wreck with no clear structure. That, while not changing too much with the stuff it does adapt from the books, cuts a frankly absurd amount of content and plot points that even the live-action movies included, and the few things they did change about the parts they adapted ended up completely ruining the conflict between Greg and Rowley. Many iconic moments in the book and the movie, like the play scenes and safety patrol, are completely absent. That 58-minute runtime, that's not because they condensed everything down into that measly runtime, they just cut out everything except for a handful of moments they wanted to adapt. I assume Kinney didn't like these moments if he considers this film to be a better version of the first book. The film goes through plot beats from the book with no structure, maintaining the flow but essentially boiling everything down into barely related 10-minute skits. You can see in this movie the point where they considered making a TV show out of it, and it does not work at all. The passage of time is incredibly wonky in this instance because instead of clearly outlining that the story takes place over the course of the school year, events take place in pockets of time with no connection to the larger plot, and it's not clear by the end that this is either supposed to be taking place at the end of the school year like in the book, or if just everything in the movie takes place during autumn. The film skips out on Christmas entirely, which is where the scene where Greg breaks Rowley's arm comes from, moves it around to be in the middle of the film and sometime after Halloween. It's an insanely confusing creative choice because it completely muddles the chronology of this f***ing children's book just for the sake of being painfully short. And what's worse is that many of these bold creative choices for the sake of making a better version of the first book ruin the entire main conflict of the first book. Greg's ego and desire to be popular is completely at odds with Rowley's more childlike and innocent qualities, finding them to be embarrassing and wanting Rowley to change who he is or risk losing his best friend. That's the main conflict between Greg and Rowley in the first book. In the movie, however, Greg doesn't come to this conclusion by himself thanks to his own ego, he gets it from Roderick. What? This is a rather strange departure from the books and Greg Heffley in general. It makes his actions far less blamable on himself, since this idea has been planted in his head by Roderick. It's not an independent thought. Guys, I don't think Jeff likes it when people call Greg a sociopath. This one change makes Greg realizing he's a bad friend feel hollow. It doesn't work. Then the safety patrol scenes, arguably some of the most important moments in regard to Greg and Rowley's friendship being tested, are just completely removed. And instead, the cartoonist competition, which is supposed to happen during this part and adds on to the pile of trouble that's about to give way on their friendship just happens completely independently of it and is also changed significantly. And the only reason I can think of why they included this part and not Safety Patrol is because they wanted to include Zooey Mama in this film.
Zooey Mama!
In the book, Greg and Rowley work on their first comic together.
Zooey Mama!
And even produce a good number of strips before Greg decides it's too repetitive and creates Creighton the Cretin, leaving Rowley to work on
Zooey Mama!
on his own. Then when Greg quits after the school censors his comic, by Rowley replaces him. Greg had screwed himself out of a comic he had previously collaborated with Rowley on, and Rowley gets to take all the credit through no fault but his own. This is after Greg accidentally got Rowley removed from Safety Patrol and then reinstated, only to get removed himself. This is supposed to be the breaking point of their relationship. In this movie, however, Safety Patrol never happens, and the cartoonist thing is entirely Greg's own idea. Is an idea that he created himself, without Rowley's help, and trashed it in favor of Creighton the Cretin. Rowley then takes this trashed idea for himself. Rowley's success in this instance feels incredibly unfair because it's not even Greg's fault, and Rowley smugly saying,
I can't help it if I'm just naturally funny.
in response to Greg's confrontation feels incredibly mean and out of character for Rowley. It artificially creates more conflict when the previous way the book and original movie handled it felt completely natural and in character for both of them. I'd list more examples, but I feel I've ranted about this movie for long enough, and we've got 2 other films to talk about. The first Diary of a Wimpy Kid film is a structural disaster, and the live-action adaptation is just blatantly superior when it comes to actually being funny and heartwarming, and also not giving me the urge to scrub my eyes off when I look at it. So thank you, Jeff, for showing us your new vision of a better version of the first book. I disagree. The movie opens with Roderick, To give Roderick Rules some honest-to-God credits, I like this version of Roderick. Sure, it's not nearly as iconic as Devin Bostick's portrayal in the live-action movies, but this version of Roderick has his own charms, and it leads to some genuinely good scenes. Admittedly, Roderick Rules is not an absolute dumpster fire of a movie. It's not a good movie by any metric, I haven't gone insane just yet, but it has a few standout moments as well as some improvements in terms of characterization. For one thing, Greg is much more accurate to the books than he was in the first movie, whereas the first movie was focusing on making a better story than the original, which either inadvertently or intentionally led to Greg becoming a likable and sympathetic character. Here, he's back to being a manipulative asshole looking out for himself, and I love it. While he's still lacking in comparison to book and live-action Greg, he does some genuinely scummy shit in this movie that feels perfectly in character. Blackmailing Roderick throughout the entire film, including getting back at him for giving him a bad science project on purpose. That's more like the Greg Heffley I grew up reading and watching. And while it doesn't lead to many scenes that are funny, I can at least be glad that this movie does Greg so much more justice than the first one did. Okay, I think this is a tad too evil. Back onto Roderick. While he again doesn't hold a candle to the live-action movies or the books, there are some great scenes here, like him teaching Greg how to play drums and the apology scene near the end where you can really feel that he really does love his brother deep down, and doesn't want them to drift apart like their dad did with his brother. Roderick Rules has a much more active, beating heart than the first film did, and I find it incredibly commendable. Grandpa Heffley has a pretty touching scene with Greg halfway through the film, where he laments about how his children grew to hate each other and won't even visit each other anymore, and is happy that from what he sees, him and Roderick are getting along well and like spending time together. Considering what we know about the current situation and Greg's constant blackmail attempts, this heart-to-heart cuts surprisingly deep. It's also bolstered by a very touching performance from Ed Eisner, who sadly passed away a year before the movie was released. And while I won't say this is the most distinguished film he's been in by a long shot, and he doesn't have many lines, he still manages to bring an emotional weight that the previous film lacked. With these qualities in mind, Roderick Rules cements itself as a vastly superior film to its predecessor, which, as you can no doubt imagine, it's a f***ing easy bar to leap over. While I can say the film's animation doesn't look as cheap as the previous movie, it still looks ridiculously cheap, and the character models continue to be deeply unsettling in a three-dimensional space. If I was hiding in a women's bathroom— okay, wait a sec. If I was like Greg Heffley and was hiding in a women's bathroom from this unwashed creature, I'd be terrified as well. But beyond the animation, the film's plot once again lacks a cohesive structure, while picking and choosing what parts from the books it wants to cram into its incredibly short runtime. Admittedly, this movie is 20 minutes longer than the first, but it moves at such a brisk pace, flowing through plot points so fast that I hardly feel that extra runtime matters. Roderick Rules does have more scenes that connect to the ongoing plot and relationship between Greg and Roderick, so that's a little bit better, but the complaint about these films feeling like disconnected skits still applies here. What really surprises me is the fact that Holly Hills just doesn't exist anymore. As of all the things I expected them to remove for this movie, she was not one of them, considering how much of an important role she plays in the next 2 books. And I get that she has more of a focus in the following 2 books, but she's still pretty relevant to the story here, and if they're really going book by book with these adaptations, then it would at least make sense if in the next one— what? While the movie has some good scenes focusing on Greg and Roderick, at many points it gets incredibly confused with whether or not they're actually getting along better. In the live-action movie, Roderick starts out messing with Greg, but over time gradually develops more respect for him and enjoys his company until they hit that breaking point with the third act breakup. Here, Roderick is constantly f***ing with Greg at multiple points before they hit the point where everything goes wrong. And while it would have been fine if this only happened at the start of it, he does this at multiple points throughout the film, even conning Greg out of cash by knowingly giving him a failed science project to turn in. This makes the impact of the third act breakup almost non-existent, and unless Roderick was explicitly stated to be bipolar and not knowingly screwing with his brother with no respect for him at all, his remarks about thinking Greg was cool run completely hollow. There were a lot of interesting creative decisions in the live-action movies that greatly benefited them as actual narratives. I only realized this myself recently from watching Meeting Halfway's interview of Jeff Kinney and Ellis Mark's own review of this movie, both of which I suggest you check out for yourself. But the Wimpy Kid books aren't exactly written with a proper narrative structure. It's written like a journal like a middle school kid would write in, which makes sense when you read it and doesn't lead to anything feeling unnaturally paced. The writers for the live-action movie knew this and took creative liberties with the story to make it fit a three-act structure. While this obviously meant that some content had to be cut, it still felt like a proper narrative and not a bunch of disjointed scenes being poorly stitched together to create the illusion of structure. As is abundantly clear, the animated movies do not follow this line of thinking, and it severely harms them as films and in comparison to its predecessors and source material. Also, these movies don't contain Roderick doing a rock cover of Justin Bieber's Baby, so they're inferior by comparison alone. I don't have a whole lot to say about this movie in comparison to the first, which I really think speaks volumes as to how many of this film's problems were symptomatic. The fact that these movies are literally written by the writer of the books yet feel dramatically worse with quite literally no funny moments at all is quite an accomplishment. If it were intentional. While Roderick Rules is a better movie by a considerable margin, it still barely feels like an actual film and still feels like it came off an assembly line. Can I just say that seeing the 100 Years of Disney logo before watching a Wimpy Kid movie makes me feel genuinely ill, so for some reason, Diary of a Wimpy Kid Cabin Fever was the next book in the series to receive an adaptation, effectively skipping The Last Straw, Dog Days, and The Ugly Truth. And while they can use the excuse that Cabin Fever is a Christmas story and is releasing around Christmas time, the previous two films released around the exact same time the previous years, and doing book 6 right after an adaptation of the first two books seems just a little bit stupid to me. I am a little upset that we've just straight up skipped The Last Straw and Dog Days, but I can't complain too much, because while the Cabin Fever movie isn't exactly a good movie, I'd say it's easily the best of the trilogy and actually managed to surprise me. For one thing, the film's plot is tremendously better than the last two films. No longer does it feel like a bunch of unrelated skits strung together over an uncertain passage of time, and instead feels like a real story with a three-act structure, because they took creative liberties with the source material. It just so happened they chose the least entertaining part of Cabin Fever to adapt for this one. Cabin Fever isn't exactly my favorite book in the series, so I might be just a little bit biased here, but I still remember finding the actual Cabin Fever part of Cabin Fever to be kind of boring and only broken up by moments. A large chunk of the plot involving the school holiday bazaar is completely cut, and that was my favorite part of the book by a long shot. Not because it was super meaningful or anything, but it was simply the part of the book I found to be more entertaining and less boring. I realize this is entering the realm of strongly opinionated, so to get back on track, out of all the movies so far, this is the one that has the largest amount of cut content from the books, and it's hard not to be a little annoyed when the live action movies were able to cover far more content in this at a brisk pace while still managing to tell a good story. The Cabin Fever movie is also not incredibly entertaining. I will say I did find a handful of jokes kind of amusing, and seeing Roderick desperately trying to power their door camera with a potato battery was f***ing hilarious to put it mildly, but other than that, I'd hardly say this movie was riveting entertainment. There was also a weird amount of licensed music in this film, which I expected for the Christmas songs, that's just a staple of Christmas movies, but Blitzkrieg Bop and The Power are used in this movie and they feel incredibly shoehorned. They probably could have used that part of the budget to improve the animation. The animation is definitely a step up from the last two films with substantially better lighting, but the whole aesthetic still looks super cheap and unpleasant to look at. I'm already finding it hard enough to get used to these characters having actual flesh. Can you stop giving me Manny's Satan angle? Also, I don't know what is up with Rowley in these movies. Rowley is meant to be childlike and innocent, and I understand that to a degree, but he feels incredibly flanderized in these films to the point where he's genuinely kind of
911, 911, 911.
Rowley, you know.
Okay, Rowley is f***ing annoying. Him being a dick and stealing Greg's comic in the first film is bad enough, and being a constant nuisance in Roderick Rules is pushing it, but Rowley in this movie is just straight up insufferable. I want to throw him in a f***ing dishwasher. Okay, everyone, let's stop with the swearing and start being constructive. Live action Rowley manages to portray a kid with childlike innocence in a way where it doesn't occupy 95% of his singular brain cell. He's charming and a complete goof while having his own sense of agency when the situation calls for it. People meme about it, but that breakup scene with Greg in the live action movie is unironically pretty great. He's not the the brightest kid around, but he's not a complete airhead. This is something the books and the live-action movie understand about Rowley. Here though, look, I know I use the term Flanderized, but he genuinely feels like a relative of Ned Flanders. Thankfully, he is not in the movie too much, but God, do you have to screw up badly to make Rowley Jefferson more unlikable than middle school Napoleon over here? Gonna finish up my complaints. The actual cabin fever parts of the story are lacking much of anything, really. There's only so long you can watch the family go slowly insane before you reach the point of, oh, okay, I'm done here, can we go? However, while the movie as a whole is still aggressively mid, that's still a large improvement compared to the first two films. And while this may just be a result of it being a Christmas movie and me being an absolute sucker for Christmas stories, it actually tells a pretty decent Christmas story. What shocked me about this film is that while it accesses 50% of the plot from the book, the remaining 50% is completely original. It still mixes in elements like Greg being scared about the cops finding him for what was clearly an accident, but instead of it being related to the school bazaar, they created an entirely new scenario involving Greg and Rowley accidentally destroying a snowplow, and this other half of the film fits into the cabin fever half extremely well. The live-action movies never took creative liberties so extreme that they straight up removed 50% of the book's plot, but I think it works here for the story they're trying to tell. Greg is also completely in character here, so is everyone in the family actually, and in terms of being a Christmas story, it genuinely pulled the rug out from under me with some legitimately sweet moments. While Greg does his act of good at the end, out of selfish intentions, they managed to show Greg being genuinely kind upon realizing the weight of his positive and negative actions in this film, and if you're gonna make people sympathetic towards Greg, Rowley hit the second tower heftily, this is how you do it. Not by making him a victim of vicious bullying, but by showing that there is a better person beneath his self-importance and selfishness, and managing to do this via a Christmas story is a pretty great idea. The Cabin Fever book sort of does this towards the end, but it's more so Greg realizing, oh, I did some good, that's cool. How can I monetize this? I still would have liked that ending, because it's funny, and totally something Greg Heffley would do, but I never expected this film to have a clever moment of deconstruction towards the end. The scene where Greg talks to the lady who owns the snowplow he broke at the beginning of the film, learning about how hard her life is and trying to provide for her son, and feeling genuinely sorry for her and all the trouble he caused, her not even realizing she's spilling her guts to the kid who broke the vehicle in the first place, and concluding that Greg is a good kid and that he should cherish the time he spends with his family. This is a genuinely touching scene. It's really good. Made even better when Greg donates his video game console to her son as a Christmas gift after hearing she couldn't afford it. Like, I'm genuinely shocked that while every other aspect of this film from the animation, humor, and general lack of entertainment is bringing it down, the actual plot is shockingly solid for a Christmas film. Even smaller aspects of this, like when Roderick finally figures out that Greg broke the snowplow and immediately shows no hesitation with protecting him over the reward money for the suspects that he's been obsessing over the entire film. Even after taunting him for half the film about figuring out the truth, was like, he's still there for his brother when all the chips are down, like he said in Roderick Rules. Like, this is a decent story. This is good characterization. Why is it attached to mid? Cabin Fever is a solid book. I'm not overly fond of it like I am for the previous ones, but it's still a solid and entertaining book. And while at the end of the day I would have greatly preferred a movie that adapted Cabin Fever as it was originally told because I think it's funnier and less boring, there are some genuine merits to this adaptation that I think allow it to stand on its own. These two stories are going for completely different vibes and reactions from people. One's funny and more cynical, the other more traditional but heartwarming. In many ways it makes this the most frustrating of the trilogy because I can see the makings of a great movie in this one. Not just an entertaining adaptation of the source material, but a legitimately good story that if just a little bit more effort placed into the events of the plot, the jokes, and the animation, could have easily claimed the title of the best Diary of a Wimpy Kid movie. Not exactly the highest honor you could receive, I realize, but I can see why a Cabin Fever movie was on the table for a while if Jeff Kinney had this kind of retelling in mind. As it stands, it's a very middle-of-the-road ending to what hasn't been a very graceful set of films, but it at least managed to pull the quality bar up from rock bottom to bargain bin DVD level, which is still technically a compliment. I've said all I can really say about these movies, I think. What an absolutely miserable trilogy. I hear there are more of these in the works, so this isn't going to stay a trilogy for very long, but it's an attractive word, and I am a YouTuber. If there's anything you should take away from this video is that the live-action trilogy, and yes, it is a trilogy, are more than worth your time if you're at all curious. They're not good films, but that hardly matters when what's on display is full of charm and still manages to be entertaining even a decade onwards. And honestly, I'm happy I got to talk about Wimpy Kid in some capacity. It's been a good few years since I've actually thought about the series, and in writing this video I've realized just how great and well written the original books were. Maybe someday I'll pick the series back up where I left off in 2015. I hear the new books aren't nearly as good as the old ones, but I'll be the judge of that personally. And I think it speaks volumes as to just how many kids and adults alike are fans of Kinney's work, that they have such strong and passionate feelings towards these adaptations. It's a testament to how good of a writer Jeff Kinney is, and I believe that one day there will be a Wimpy Kid adaptation that's not just good at taking taking stuff from the books and applying it to a proper story structure and script, but can stand on its own as a genuinely great and fun movie that anyone can enjoy. Until then, you've got 3 options if you want your Diary of a Wimpy Kid fix in film: the holy route, the satanic route, and hanging yourself.